Welcome, everyone. I am so pleased that you've joined us for this discussion today, co-hosted by Compassion and Choices, Union Theological Seminary, and SAGE. We have an amazing panel this afternoon to lead us in a somewhat difficult but very important discussion about medical aid in dying in New York. I want to go over some logistics for your participation today. This event is being recorded and broadcast live on Facebook. If you are participating in this event, no worries, you're not on camera. Only the panelists will be on camera during the event today, and so only their images and the videos that we display will be available on Facebook and in the recording. If you have questions throughout the event, I want to direct your attention to the chat box on your screen or the comments section in Facebook. You can type your questions there. If our panelists can answer your questions easily, we'll answer it in the chat box. Some of your questions we'll take during our live question and answer section after the panelists speak. Throughout today's event, we'll be asking for your interaction. We have a few poll questions we'll be asking you, and you can just record your answers on the screen, click the box off, and get back to watching the rest of the presentation. I want to start us off by sharing the following video with you, and then I'll be back to introduce our moderator.
I can't tell you how many family members I've spoken to where someone ended their life prematurely, where there was a suicide, where someone was young and they had so many years ahead of them.
Medical aid in dying, from my perspective, is not suicide. You never know how God works out things. So that may be his way of really just transitioning you to the next level, to prevent you from suffering. Some people just can't take pain, they can't suffer.
Medical aid in dying gives a person with less than 6 months to live the opportunity to end their life without pain and suffering, rather than to endure the contortions, the spasms, the convulsions, and the pain associated with a wide variety of diseases.
There is some understanding that you have to have patience in letting people come to their own decision, but at the same time you have to remind them the urgency of this means that someone will have the opportunity to end their life in a way that is dignified, in a way that shows compassion.
It's time that we tell them that they no longer have the legislature on their side to oppose this bill. I'm thrilled to work with people like Donna and Sasha and others who are fighting for this bill, because for far too long, God has been put in a box. For those of us who pray and worship him every single day, we know he's bigger than that. Thank you.
The thing that got my attention is that we're born to die. I mean, it's philosophical, but it's a fact. We're going to die. It's just a matter of when and how. And so the fact that you have a choice if you're terminally ill was really intriguing to me, because my philosophy is this is why I like compassion and choices. If I say I believe in God, and I do, not just as a pastor, but as a person, so wherever God is, that's where I want to be. So I don't worry about heaven and hell and this kind. Wherever God is all right with me.
Here we have an opportunity with medical aid in dying that it is not suicide. It is not suicide. This is a situation of someone who is not mentally ill, but someone who is mentally capable to be able to make a decision or not as to whether they want to take a prescription medication to end their suffering.
Our enemies are the diseases that are attacking our body. And if I have an opportunity through medical aid in dying to end my life in comfort and in peace, if that is what's before me in my final days, I want the option to choose medical aid in dying. Because if my enemy, my disease, catches up with me, it will torture me, it will dismember me, and it will humiliate me. And that's not the way I want to die.
My name is Corinne Carey, and I am the Senior Campaign Director for New York and New Jersey for Compassion and Choices. I am honored to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's event, Dr. Pamela Cooper-White. The Reverend Pamela Cooper-White is the Academic Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Christiane Brooks Johnson Professor of Psychology and Religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She is an Episcopal priest, a licensed clinical professional counselor, and a certified pastoral psychotherapist. She has regularly taught a graduate seminary course on death, dying, and bereavement for over 2 decades, and was a moderator and panelist with Dr. Jessica Zitter, featured in the film Extremis, during the Bicoastal Reimagine End of Life Symposium in 2018. Our discussion this afternoon is in good hands with Dr. Cooper-White.
Thank you, Corinne. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us to talk about this incredibly important, if difficult, topic. I confess I come to this conversation today as a bit of a convert to the cause. Like some of you, I had never encountered the term medical aid in dying before, and I kind of had a gut aversion to the idea. My church, the Episcopal Church, declared in 1991 that, quote, while there is no moral obligation to prolong the act of dying by extraordinary means and at all costs, if such dying person is ill and has no reasonable expectation of recovery, quote, despite the hope of the resurrection, it is morally wrong and unacceptable to take a human life in order to relieve the suffering caused by incurable illness, end quote. I think without really considering it deeply, I considered medical aid in dying to be the same as assisted suicide. And while as a therapist, I have long thought it was the right of a suffering person to end their own life, I could not wrap my mind around the idea of taking someone else's life or assisting them in doing so. And I feared the potential for abuse in the name of euthanasia. There are some important distinctions to be made, however, which I'm now beginning to understand in a deeper way, thanks in part to these colleagues on the webinar today. Medical aid in dying is not suicide, as my colleagues on this panel have taught me. Medical aid in dying is compassionate because it empowers a dying person's self-determination to end incurable and irremediable suffering, not to end a still promising life prematurely. Nor is it euthanasia or taking another person's life in which the dying person may have had no say. Prominent voices in my own church have now come out and advocated for medical aid in dying, including American Bishop Gene Robinson and African Bishop Desmond Tutu. These are both bishops who have had a long history of advocating for social justice. Bishop Robinson was the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church. Bishop Tutu's work to end apartheid in South Africa is well known. I read their statements endorsing medical aid in dying to be continuous with their lifelong struggles for justice and freedom for all people. As the well-known NPR journalist Diane Rehm has so movingly written and spoken in her recent documentary called When My Time Comes, she watched her beloved husband when he was in the end stages of Parkinson's disease slowly starve himself to death, a terribly painful and prolonged way to end his life because there was no law in the state allowing a humane, painless means for him to end his own suffering when he knew his time had come to die. As a therapist and a pastoral counselor, I was taught that the first rule of ethical care is first do no harm. When a person is in irremediable agony and there is no hope for a cure, wouldn't we consider that withholding medicine that could end that agony is doing harm? Finally, as a pastoral theologian, I've always understood the work of both spiritual care and theology to be the work of promoting the flourishing of life. As in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "I came that they might have life and have it abundantly." Advocating for flourishing, which entails both compassion and justice making, also means working to end suffering. Martin Luther once famously said the three enemies of the Christian are sin, death, and the devil. This is a long-held view in Christianity, especially since medieval times, when the fear of a literal hell kept people in constant spiritual anxiety, and not incidentally allowed the church to rule over them. But what if we understood death not as always the enemy, but a friend who brings peace and an end to suffering, when, as in the book of Ecclesiastes, it is a time to die? If we believe in a God who above all is merciful and compassionate, then how can we imagine that such a loving God would condemn for eternity someone who chose to end their terminal suffering through medical means? Can we not imagine that by empowering a dying person to choose when to end irremediable pain, we are not just advocating to end a life, but to save it? Thank you. I believe the first thing we're going to do next is to have the poll for your first question to consider your own feelings and thoughts about this. Which of these experiences have you had? I've thought about the kind of care I want at the end of life. I've communicated with my loved ones what my end of life wishes are. I have put my end of life wishes in an advanced care planning document, such as a living will. I have communicated with my healthcare provider about my end of life wishes. I have spoken with someone in my religious congregation about their fears and wishes at the end of life. And I believe you can check as many boxes as pertain. Is that correct? Okay. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our newest trustee at Union Theological Seminary and a good friend and alum of many of us at Union Theological Seminary, the Reverend Madison Shockley. Reverend Madison T. Shockley II is the pastor of the Pilgrim United Church of Christ in Carlsbad, California. He brings to Pilgrim Church a wealth of experience from his work in the religious, political, nonprofit, and media environments. Madison was called to Pilgrim Church in 2004. Along with performing his pastoral duties at Pilgrim, Madison serves on the board of directors of the American Civil Liberties Union of San Diego and Imperial Counties, the board of directors of Compassion and Choices, and has recently joined the board here at Union. Madison also writes commentary for various online and print outlets. And he holds the Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in what year, Madison?
That was in 1986.
Okay. And has also done advanced graduate work at Claremont Graduate University in New Testament Studies. He is married to Gail P. Shockley, née Welch, and they are the parents of 4 adult children. Please welcome Dr. Shockley.
Thank you for the promotion there, Dean Cooper White, but I only got the master's degree.
Okay.
Either way, that's all right. I am very pleased to be here today. I've been a part of this movement for over 15 years here in California, where we have the End of Life Option Act that gives mentally competent, terminally ill adults the option of choosing medical aid and dying for themselves. As a pastor, I have witnessed what it means to die peacefully. We write our death notices when our members pass, and we like to say, John died peacefully in his sleep. But as a pastor, I've also learned that not every death is this way. But I can never remember seeing a death notice that said, John died struggling to breathe and in pain, with his wife in helpless anguish, by his side. But that is the reality for many persons who die. I have had members who were terminally ill, begging God for death. I have also witnessed a peaceful death where the person was lucid to the end, surrounded by loving family, able to sit and ask questions and to query their grandchildren about their plans for their future lives, lives that that person would not see, but was pleased to imagine through that conversation. That person was my father. I learned through his death that while I'm not a medical professional, I did learn that different diseases have different death processes. Bone cancer is typically very painful and very prolonged. Liver cancer can be quiet and peaceful. You just kind of go to sleep. Those were the two paths that my father's illness could take. Fortunately, the liver cancer delivered him to a peaceful and lucid death. That was 10 years ago. My father didn't have an option. He was at the mercy of his illness. As a pastor, the pastors that are watching this program today, I encourage you to learn about medical aid in dying, regardless of your personal feelings and your personal decisions about your life and death. You will have members who will want to choose medical aid in dying, and they will come to you for spiritual discernment. And so I pray that you will have a full education and be able to present them with a full understanding of what medical aid in dying means. As I shared in the video earlier, death is not our enemy. Death is part of life. As Dr. Cooper White pointed out, we are born to die, but the manner of our death is important to us. We want to die as we lived, with dignity, with autonomy, with intention, and with purpose. And many people who access a prescription for medical aid in dying never actually ingest the medication, but they receive a tremendous benefit mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to know that if the course of their death process turns in a direction of convulsions and pain that is irremediable through other means, the medical aid in dying is available to them to end that suffering or to prevent that suffering and to give them an opportunity to share with their loved ones a peaceful, pleasant, quiet final moment. I encourage you to learn as much as you can so that you can be a pastor to your members. And those of you who are lay folk, I encourage you to speak to your pastors, to ask them if they are aware, if they understand, and what the theology and teaching of your church is. We are not advocating that every church adopt medical aid in dying, but we do encourage every church to have thought about it, thought it through, and be able to help their members discern for their own lives and their own deaths what is within the bounds of their faith and their teaching. My church, the United Church of Christ, does offer support to those who choose medical aid in dying for themselves. This is the essence of our national debate, however. Religious freedom means that each person can choose for themselves how they live out their faith. And whether a particular church teaches against medical aid in dying, that is their prerogative. But it should not govern the law that governs all of us. Religious freedom means that I can choose medical aid in dying, and I can support the members of my congregation in their decision to access medical aid in dying. That's what we hope for, the freedom for everyone to live and to die according to their own faith and their own religious and spiritual principles. And there are many denominations and many faiths that embrace medical aid in dying with an understanding that God derives no pleasure from our suffering and from our pain, and that the God of love and the God of compassion is with us even unto death and in our dying. Thank you.
Thank you. And here we have the poll results from the first poll. And it's heartening to see that almost all of you have thought about the kind of care you want at the end of life, communicating with loved ones about your end of life wishes, perhaps putting them in an advanced care planning document, which we all would strongly recommend that you do. Less people have actually spoken with their healthcare provider, and the least have spoken with someone in their religious congregation, a pastor, a rabbi, an imam, or someone in the congregation about the way that you would like to end your life. So interesting poll results. Thank you for that. And I would like next to introduce Senator Diane Savino, sponsor of New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act. New York State Senator Diane J. Savino was born and raised in Astoria, Queens. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in sociology from St. John's University, and also has a degree in industrial and labor relations from Cornell University. Diane Savino has dedicated her entire professional career towards improving the lives of working families. She began her career in public service as a caseworker for New York City's Child Welfare Administration, providing direct assistance to abused and neglected children. An active member of her local labor union, the Social Service Employees Union, Local 371 DC 37 of AFS-CME, she quickly rose through the ranks to become the Vice President for Political Action and Legislative Affairs, where she became one of the most respected labor leaders in New York State. In 2004, she was elected to represent the 23rd Senatorial District, which encompasses the north and east shores of Staten Island and portions of southern Brooklyn. In their endorsement of Senator Savino, the New York Times described her as scrappy and effective. Sounds like a line from Hamilton. Senator Savino's hard work and influence has produced strong results for her constituents and for all of New York State. One example of the results she's capable of producing is New York's medical marijuana law. She championed the Compassionate Care Act through the legislative process despite opposition and a campaign of misinformation. This law now provides relief to countless New Yorkers across the state. Senator Savino is the prime bill sponsor of New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act and has carried the bill since 2015. Please welcome Senator Diane Savino.
Thank you. First, let me thank Dr. Cooper White for that very kind introduction. And I also want to express my gratitude to the Union Theological Seminary for hosting today's event. Unfortunately, I wish we could all be together, but hopefully soon. We're seeing great, tremendous progress with the fight against the pandemic, and I think next time we might actually be together. I also want to thank Michael Adams and Sage for all that you do and for your advocacy. Along with the Union Theological Seminary, you help make New York actually a better place. Let me start with a very simple declarative statement. Quite simply, the time has come for New York to pass the Medical Aid in Dying Act. 10 states, including New York's neighbor, Vermont and New Jersey, and now Washington, D.C., now authorize this compassionate end-of-life option for those suffering from an incurable terminal disease with a prognosis of less than 6 months to live. Just a couple of weeks ago, New Mexico became the 10th state. I really want New York to be the 11th. Now, I know that for many people, this is a tough issue to discuss. Trust me, as the sponsor of this bill for the past 5 years, I know how hard it is. I've had conversations with many members of the legislature, many members of the community, many members of the clergy. And as a Catholic, I know how hard it is to talk about medical aid in dying. I've had several interesting conversations with Cardinal Dolan about it. If we had more time, I'd tell you about them. We all bring very different personal experiences and beliefs to our consideration of this issue. And I recognize that medical aid in dying is not the right option for everyone. but I continue to argue that it is an option, like hospice and palliative care, that should be available to every New Yorker, no matter what choice they ultimately make. You'll soon hear from Monona Yin, a wonderful woman and a daughter who's going to talk about her amazing mother, Fei Ho Yin. Monona's story is deeply moving and personal, but her story is not unique. In fact, it is rare that I have a conversation with someone who does not have an intensely personal story about a parent, a spouse, a loved family member, or a friend who has suffered through a horrible dying process and death, often despite the best efforts of hospice and palliative care. I've experienced it in my own family. I watched my mother pass away, unfortunately, too soon. I watched my father die, a very painful death due to lung cancer. I watched my grandfather die, a painful death due to lung cancer. And I think if we asked either one of them, they might have wanted to have the option of medical aid in dying. Why shouldn't they? Let me take a moment here to briefly summarize this bill, because I think there's a lot of misconception about what medical aid in dying is. It is not assisted suicide. And there's a lot of safeguards, so let's talk about it. It would only be eligible for a mentally capable adult with a terminal illness and a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, who is able to self-ingest the medication. There are more than a dozen safeguards in the bill. Safeguards, I might add, based on a quarter century of experience since Oregon's Death with Dignity law was first used in 1997. Let's just highlight a few of them. Both the diagnosis and the prognosis have to be confirmed by 2 doctors. Both doctors must be assured that the patient is making the request of their own volition. This has been a big issue with advocates in the disabilities community. They're very concerned that people who suffer from disabilities will be forced to access medical aid in dying against their will. We make sure that does not happen under this bill. The attending physician must inform the requesting patient about all of their end-of-life care options, including hospice and palliative care. Medical aid in dying is not an alternative to hospice and medical care and palliative care. It's in addition to. If either doctor has concerns about the patient's mental capacity for such a decision, they must make a referral to a mental health professional for an assessment. Medication cannot be prescribed if the patient is determined to not have mental capacity. As I said, medical aid in dying laws have existed in this country for nearly a quarter of a century, and we have evidence and experience from all the states and Washington, D.C., from all the years the law has been authorized in those jurisdictions. So let me be blunt, because I don't know how to be any other way. I am not aware of a single case in any of those jurisdictions where there has been a single problem with the way these laws have been implemented, not one. Yet those laws provide comfort to millions of people, even though we know very few will ever be eligible for medical aid in dying. Even fewer will request it, and even fewer will actually take the medication if they do request it. I urge everyone participating in today's town hall to listen carefully to Monona and her story. Think about the deaths of those close to you, and whether medical aid in dying would have been an option for your loved one. And would they have chosen to either ease their suffering, and would it have provided them with peace at the end of their life? None of us likes to think about it, but I'm asking you to think about it. Do you want this option for yourself? I'm not asking whether you would ask for it or take medical aid in dying. I'm not sure I can answer that question myself. I'm asking you whether you want to have the option for you, for yourself, or someone close to you. I know I do. And if you do, I'm urging you to call or write your legislators today. Urge my colleagues to join Assemblymember Paulin and me as we try to make 2021 the year we stop the suffering for too many and pass the Medical Aid in Dying Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I think we're ready for our second poll. Ian? Our religious beliefs and values tend to influence our choices throughout life and also at death. Do you believe that lawmakers should cite religious objections as a reason to not pass the bill? And this is a single choice. Yes, I think that's a valid reason. Yes, but only if those religious objections are their own. No, because they represent voters who may not share their religious views, or it depends. So please begin the poll. And it's now my pleasure and honor to introduce Monona Yin. She is a family caregiver and volunteer advocate. Mona Yin is the daughter of Fei Ho Yin, an extraordinary woman who advocated for the option of medical aid in dying until her death on July 20th, 2020. Monona started her career in social justice philanthropy as Associate Director of North Star Fund. She's a co-founder and former staff member of CAAAV, Organizing Asian Communities, and recently published her mother's memoirs, Riding with the Wind, 3 Generations of My Family in China. We will first see a video about Fei Ho Yin's decision, and then we will hear directly from Monona.
My name is Fei Ho Yin. I have incurable T-cell lymphoma.
And my name is Monona Yin. I'm Fei's daughter, and we live together.
I'm very close to my family, my kids, and whatever time I can buy with them, I'm perfectly willing to go through it. 6 cycles of treatment, 4 weeks in between. I'm also taking a ton of prescription drug, anti-cancer, anti-nausea, prevention of pneumonia, you name it, I got it. But if I get to the point where I'm in pain, I may have a different set of mind, and depending how long I can put up with it. By God, I've already had a pretty hard time just breathing. Most of us who are sick do not want to die. We want to live. You only come to that point where you want to die is when life becomes unbearable. I'm feeling so strong about it because I witnessed 2 bad deaths of my loved ones, my own mother and a very good friend. When Monona visited my mother said to her, I want to die, I cannot die. I want to live, I cannot live. That made such an impression on me.
I'm really proud of my mom because she is, for me, the embodiment of people who want to live. And if it's important to her to have some sense that she doesn't have to suffer unnecessarily, that's what this bill is about for me. I think every religion I've ever heard about could be boiled down to love, every single one, and kindness. I think this bill is a wonderful expression of that. It is an expression of faith. Good afternoon. It's a real honor to be here with all the other speakers. My name is Monona Yin, and I'm here today because my mother faced her death as bravely as she lived her life. She was a tough lady, having grown up in wartime China, where she survived and witnessed some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. She came to the US alone at age 19, built a family and a career, but then was tragically widowed at the age of 37 with 2 little kids. But she never buckled, never remarried. She and my father's mother raised me and my brother in a secure and loving home. After retiring as a scientist, she enjoyed 23 years of folk dancing, writing, and hang out with her friends. We should all be so lucky, right? We were sure that she would go on this way at least to the age of 90. It was therefore a terrible shock when she was diagnosed with lymphoma in 2014. My mother worked hard for the next 6 years to stay alive. She endured 2 courses of chemotherapy, 1 of radiation, and over 25 transfusions in the last 6 months of her life. No one can say that she gave up. My mother's perspective on death was deeply informed by having cared for both of my grandmothers through long illnesses. One died peacefully with a minimum of suffering, and the other lingered for 2 years in purgatory. You heard the quote that so traumatized my mother. I want to die, but I cannot die. I want to live, but I cannot live. Last April, Mom asked me if we could move to New Jersey because medical aid in dying is legal there. I spent an entire weekend doing research, but it was too late. The logistics were just insurmountable. It seemed like a cruel joke that salvation lay just a few miles across the river. By the end, Mom was just skin and bones. She struggled to breathe, even with a powerful oxygen machine. She could no longer walk or control her bodily functions. It pained her that her children had to witness her complete devastation. She had lived a good life, discharged all her duties faithfully. She couldn't understand why she should be made to suffer to the bitter end. We don't inflict that cruelty on the animals we love. Why then on the people we love the most? My mother did not find her suffering to be ennobling, nor honorable. She thought it was just pure misery to fall apart bit by bit to the point where you have no quality of life or desire to go on, even with the best palliative care, which we had and which I fully support. Medical aid in dying relieves 2 kinds of suffering, and I don't believe this is well understood. The first is the physical pain that others have spoken of movingly. But the second is the psychic pain of fear, fearing that you will be made to suffer unnecessarily. For my mom, this psychic suffering started in 2014, but it built to a crescendo in the last year of her life. It robbed us of so much precious time that my family could have otherwise enjoyed. She viewed medical aid in dying as an insurance policy that she might use only at the very end. In fact, 1/3 of all people never even take their prescriptions, but that does not diminish the tremendous value and peace of mind of having that option. Since this is a gathering rooted in faith, I want to share that caring for my mother through to her death was as sacred an experience as giving birth to my daughter was. In some ways, even more so, because my mother and I became so close. As she grew weaker, everything unimportant fell away. What was left was a heightened awareness of how much we loved each other. Every meal or conversation we shared was precious because we didn't know how many more we would get. My mom and I had to talk plainly about what she wanted and what she didn't want. We explored every scenario and talked to specialists of all kinds. She did the hardest work of getting clear with herself and then sharing that with me. I was entrusted with helping her to die well, a sacred duty if there ever was one. Through her, I learned how you die matters tremendously to your own peace of mind, as well as to that of your loved ones who have to live with the consequences. We don't ask that anyone else use medical aid in dying. It is absolutely a very personal and private decision. We only ask that society not block people like my mother from having the option and the peace of mind that comes with it. If you are worried about the possibility of abuse, please look into the facts. As Senator Savino said, medical aid in dying has been legal for a combined 40 years in 10 jurisdictions since Oregon first passed their referendum in 1994. In all that time, there has not been a single documented case of abuse or coercion. So we're not talking anymore about hypotheticals. This law is working exactly as intended across the country. Why should New Yorkers be deprived of the same end-of-life mercy as their neighbors in New Jersey? Lastly, you may ask why medical aid in dying is a priority when our society is struggling with so much sickness, poverty, division, injustice, and violence. Well, I would simply say, Here is one form of suffering that we can end right now together. If we pass this law in New York State, people like my mother can have the peace they crave without hurting anyone else in the process. To me, that would be a tremendous mitzvah rooted in the values of compassion, kindness, and love. Thank you.
Thank you, Monona, for that film and for that moving testimony. And we have poll results about our religious beliefs. And the results are, our religious beliefs and values tend to influence our choices throughout life and also at death. Do you believe that lawmakers should cite religious objections as a reason to not pass the bill? Yes, I think it's a valid reason. 4 people, 3%. Yes, but only if those religious objections are their own, 8 people or 5%. The vast majority, no, because they represent voters who may not share their religious views, 132 participants or 84%. And it depends, 13 people, 8%. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. If we can get Michael Adams up on the screen. Michael Adams, who happens to be a good friend of Union Seminary, is the Chief Executive Officer of SAGE, Advocacy and Services for LGBTQ Elders, and the world's largest and oldest organization dedicated to improving the lives of LGBT older people. Founded in 1978 and headquartered in New York City, SAGE is a national organization that offers supportive services and consumer resources to LGBT older people and their caregivers, advocates for public policy changes that address the needs of LGBT elders, provides education and technical assistance for aging providers and LGBT community organizations through its National Resource Center on LGBT Aging, and offers cultural competency training through SAGE Care. Prior to joining SAGE, Adams was the Director of Education and Public Affairs for Lambda Legal. Prior to that, he spent a decade leading cutting-edge litigation that established new rights for LGBT people, first as Associate Director of the ACLU's LGBT project, and then as Deputy Legal Director at Lambda Legal. A graduate of Stanford Law School and Harvard College, Adams has authored numerous publications on an array of LGBT issues. He has taught law school courses on sexual orientation and gender identity, and has served on advisory councils for AARP, Fortune 500 companies, leading universities, and the New York City Department for the Aging, among others. Adams is the chair of the board of directors of the American Society on Aging. And not incidentally for us, he is also the spouse of our executive vice president at Union, Fred Davey. Please welcome Michael Adams.
Thank you so much, Pamela. It's really a great honor to be here on a program with such an extraordinary collection of speakers sharing such powerful perspectives. And I always feel a great warmth in my heart to do anything that involves Union Theological Seminary. In speaking today, I feel like I'm speaking in the spirit of several people who are very important to me and very important to SAGE. They include Jay Callio, a longtime SAGE activist who we lost to a very, very difficult terminal illness a number of years ago that Jay contracted as a result of being a 9/11 responder. Jay was a great, great champion for medical aid in dying in the years prior to his death. In the spirit of Bishop Gene Robinson, who was referenced earlier, and who's been such a leader for both the Episcopal Church and for our LGBTQ community. And in the spirit of Frank Stark, who is a SAGE board member and somebody who has been a great champion of compassion and choices, and who led the conversation with SAGE's board of directors a number of years ago that resulted in our organization energetically embracing medical aid in dying as a part of our advocacy agenda with and on behalf of LGBTQ older adults. So this is a very important conversation for SAGE and our LGBT elder constituents. And in profound ways, this conversation really goes to the heart of our human experience about who we are as LGBTQ people. Because this is a conversation about self-deliverance, which is an affirmation of life and a voluntary choice about how one wants to live the final chapters of one's life. And as LGBTQ people, we know a lot about that because we've already made life-affirming decisions about how to live our lives, sometimes decisions that are contrary to decisions other people would make. But there are choices to make as full human beings and autonomous members of our society. So this perspective and this experience gives folks in LGBTQ communities, especially elders, who fought so hard to build our communities and to create this space of freedom and liberation, gives us a deep sense of the importance of autonomy in making essential life decisions, including decisions about health and dying. I saw a question in the chat earlier from one of our attendees who asked, how do we define a good death? And I think at SAGE, we would say that we would define that as a passing, as a final chapter that reflects the light, the principles, the autonomy, the dignity, and the choices of the individual who is facing a terminal illness. Now, our elders in LGBTQ communities have the perspectives that come from living through not one, but two pandemics. The first being the AIDS pandemic, and now, of course, in the pandemic we are in, the pandemic of COVID-19. In the AIDS pandemic, we were forced at a young age to learn the importance of making our own autonomous decisions about end of life in the most horrible of health circumstances. People from LGBTQ communities and many other communities of my age lived through that experience. We lost many loved ones. We lost many friends. We learned how to die with dignity in the most painful and difficult of circumstances. And we bring those lessons as a community, those lessons from the AIDS pandemic, we bring those lessons to this conversation. And speaking from personal experience that will stay with me forever, I recall vividly how important it was to the close friends who I had who died during the AIDS epidemic, how important it was to them, but they had some agency in when their time and pain would end. I saw up close how their knowledge of their own autonomy and sense of control over their life increased their ability to live fully, to live their lives fully until the end. In our community's experiences, control over one's life is essential to living and celebrating that life fully to the very end. It's also important to recognize that many LGBTQ older adults are aging alone and with very, very little by way of support systems. That adds to the texture of some of our community's members' experiences with terminal illness. And of course, that adds to the perspective of our experience here. This issue is a very important one for SAGE. Many of our elder pioneers are growing old, in isolation, and without the support that we would want them to have. They're elders who have struggled their entire lives for the freedom and the space to be autonomous individuals and to control the direction of their lives and to control how their lives unfold. And that includes a last chapter where terminal illness is at issue. SAGE is more than a services and advocacy organization. We're an expression of the conscience of our community to embrace our elders, to embrace every person struggling with terminal illness, and to embrace aging, including aging at the end of life and illness at the end of life. It's our responsibility to lift up the voices and perspectives of our elders and to vigorously support their right as elders to make their own decisions about how to live their lives and how to navigate terminal illness and the pain and suffering that arises with it. We see that as a sacred responsibility, bringing that perspective forward and this advocacy forward as a sacred responsibility on SAGE's part. So those are the comments I'd like to share today. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conversation with my friends at Union and with the other extraordinary panelists in the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks to all of our panelists. This has been a rich and deep diving conversation that we've learned so much from all of you. I want to turn it over now to Corinne from Compassion and Choices, who will make a few closing remarks and then open it up for Q&A. Corinne?
Thank you so much. My father found out that he had end-stage lung cancer in 2013. A strong Marine who didn't even want pain medication. It was his belief that suffering was not only a part of life, but his obligation to bear as a Catholic. His faith was very strong. My dad died the way he wanted to. He suffered, yes, but mercifully for me and for my family, not for too long. He died at home, surrounded by his loved ones. He died a dignified death. Everyone deserves a dignified death. And what I learned from my dad's death was that everyone deserves a death that is consistent with their faith, their values, and their beliefs, whatever that means to them. That's why I took on the campaign to pass New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act for Compassion and Choices. Because that's what this bill would do. I know this because that is what the bill has done for our neighbors in New Jersey and the more than 22% of people in this country who now have access to this compassionate option. When this law passes, and it eventually will, I have no doubt of that, nothing will change for those who don't believe in medical aid in dying. But everything will change for those who need it. The question is, how many more people have to suffer before this bill passes? Some opponents say that the solution to suffering at the end of life is to improve access to hospice and palliative care. This care has improved immensely since 1984, when the first law authorizing medical aid in dying passed in this country, and it provides relief to countless New Yorkers. It certainly helped my family. But we know that even the best hospice and palliative care can't relieve everyone's suffering. It can't even guarantee relief from actual pain for everyone. As we mentioned, Jay Callio was a 9/11 first responder. He was an outspoken advocate for medical aid in dying and a volunteer with SAGE. We posted a video that he recorded for us in the chat box if you have a chance to look at it after this program. Jay was receiving excellent palliative care at a premier hospital in New York City, but for the last 11 hours of his life, nurses and doctors, despite their very best efforts, scrambled to address severe breakthrough pain as he screamed and cried for help. That experience traumatized his partner, Bonnie, and the nurses who cared for him. I have traveled across the state from Buffalo to Brooklyn, Malone in the North Country to Montauk on Long Island. I've listened to thousands of New Yorkers, and two things are absolutely clear from those conversations. Everyone wants a dignified death, regardless of how they define it, and no one wants a loved one to endure needless suffering. I led the campaign to pass medical aid in dying in New Jersey, and now I work with patients and families, doctors and hospice providers to ensure that the law is working well. I could share statistics with you from around the country and from New Jersey about how few people use it, how it's improved the quality of life for everyone touched by the law, that no one has ever been denied life insurance, that no doctor has ever faced civil or criminal prosecution for misconduct. Simply put, the law works as intended for whom it's intended, and it has for more than 2 decades. But what's more powerful and what motivates me the most is not facts and figures, but the real stories of real New Yorkers I've listened to, desperate for this option now. Let me leave you with this idea, relayed in an opinion piece written by Dr. Jessica Israel after New Jersey's law passed. She described how, when she wrote the prescription for her first patient, she realized that it wasn't about helping her patient to die. It was about helping him to live his life to the fullest at the end. About allowing him, for example, the peace of mind to stop worrying about suffering and focus on the things that were most important, like writing a letter to his daughter for her to open on her wedding day, long after he passed. In the end, this bill isn't about death. It's about how we want to live our lives at the end. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Dr. Cooper White to read our last poll question, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Or actually, Dr. Cooper White, I'll do this poll. Let's put it up. So question number 3 is, do you believe that terminally ill adults with 6 months or less to live should be allowed the option of medical aid in dying? And the answers here are simple: yes, no, or you can choose that this discussion has changed your view on this subject. And with that, once you answer the question, we are going to open it up now and see what questions we have here. I guess we've gotten a lot of questions in the chat for Senator Savino, and she's answered some of them here, but I think I'm gonna try to bundle them and toss it over to Senator Savino to speak for a moment. The questions are, when is the bill gonna be introduced? What are the obstacles? How can we help? And what's the timeline? Can you address those questions, Senator Savino?
So, as some may know, we've had a tremendous changeover in the legislatures just in this legislative session alone. So we now have, so think about this. I've been in the Senate 17 years now. I am one of 8 members left that are still in the Senate from when I got elected. And in the past 2 years, I am one of only 8 that were in the last session. What that means is we've had a tremendous turnover. So there are a whole lot of people who had originally signed onto the bill when I introduced it 5 years ago that are no longer members of the Senate, that signed onto the bill in the last legislative term that are no longer members of the Senate. So it's a whole new education process of talking about medical aid in dying with the new members, seeking out new co-sponsors, answering all of their questions. And so it's a complicated discussion as we're having here today. And so we're at the process now where we're recirculating the bill and getting all new co-sponsors. We hope to have the bill. We could file it tomorrow. We're trying to get as many co-sponsors as possible. I know someone in the chat asked about what makes it so difficult to get this bill passed and what are the obstacles. A lot of it is misconception about what medical aid in dying is. And I think I tried to answer the person in the chat, but let's go through it. So there's always been, is it assisted suicide? And I think we've tried to answer that clearly in the statute. It is not. And then there's always been objections from people who believe, for religious purposes, that this is suicide, and they're opposed to that. So it's not just, there's no organized religion that supports this, and it's not just Catholics. I hear from Jewish organizations, I hear from Muslim organizations, I hear from Baptists, I hear from everybody, except for those of you who are here with us today. It is an issue that they are widely opposed to because of their faith. And it bothers members. Now, members are not supposed to make votes based upon religion. However, people still, religion kind of affects the way we approach life. As I said, I'm a Catholic and I have to struggle with those things too, but I make laws for everybody, not just for Catholics. But that has been a factor. It has affected the way some people looked at this bill. So again, it's an education process, walking them through why this is not suicide. Suicide is an act of desperation. This is an act of affirmation, people recognizing that they don't have to suffer, that death is an inevitability, and this is empowering people. And then there's been a lot of opposition, Corinne, as you know, from disability rights activists for several years. In fact, they've been the loudest opponents when we do rallies in Albany, they would come and they would heckle us because there's been some concern amongst the disability rights activists that they would be sacrificed by their family members, forced to avail themselves of death with medical aid and dying because their family members don't want to be required to take care of them later points in life. In spite of our best efforts to educate some of them, they continue to perpetuate that fallacy to some of the new members that this would be used against them. There are other organizations that think the bill doesn't go far enough. So there are, I've heard from members who say that, well, what about people who have Huntington's disease and people who have Parkinson's disease and people who have ALS? That may be a terminal disease eventually, but it won't kill you you can't get a terminal diagnosis within 6 months. And what about patients like that, or patients who, because of their illness, won't be able to self-administer? It's not fair. Someone in the chat asked about Alzheimer's or dementia. So there are going to be patients who have illnesses that will never qualify under this bill. And so these are constant conversations where people say, I support the bill in principle, but. And so every time we hit the but, we have to have another, conversation. We are never going to be able to capture everybody with medical aid and dying. And I think we just have to keep pushing through to say that just because we can't help everyone doesn't mean we shouldn't help someone. And that's where we are right now.
Thank you, Senator Savino. I think Monona unmuted herself. She might want to say something. I do want to ask Reverend Shockley a follow-up question. Monona, did you want to say something, or did you just unmute your button?
I just wanted to say that I've been profoundly inspired by the people with disabilities movement. And what I have gained from it is the bedrock principle of self-determination, which I think is very consistent with this bill. People with disabilities have defined what they consider to be the value of their own lives, just like Michael was saying about LGBTQ people. And they have asserted their humanity from a position of real strength. And so I would just hope that opponents would see the very real connections that I see between that movement and this bill.
Thank you for that, Monona. I do think, I wanted to make a comment too, that oftentimes we see leaders in some of these communities being some of the loudest opponents, but they're not necessarily representing congregants, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We know from surveys that 70% of Catholics think that people should have this option, even if they would never use it themselves. We know that people of faith across all of these religions overwhelmingly support people having this option. So in some ways, it's like the leaders may not be in sync with people who go to services, right? I think that's true in the disability rights community as well. Some of the loudest voices, as you noted, Senator Savino, are from people living with disabilities, the leaders in those communities, but polling shows that people living with disabilities support this in the same measure. And that's why I think we see groups like the Resource Center for Independent Living, one of the largest disability rights groups in Utica in central New York. They're neutral on this issue. They think it should be a private decision made between a doctor and their patient and the patient's family. And the ARC of New York, which is the oldest, venerable disability rights organization founded in 1946, they support medical aid in dying. And I think that they agree with what you said. They think it doesn't go far enough to allow people the ability to use the option. So it's an interesting phenomenon, I think, that sometimes leaders are out of step with their communities.
Mm-hmm. But some of them, and again, it's not all of them. As you know, there's a subgroup. They call themselves Not Dead Yet, and they try to make the case that the disability is the equivalent of a terminal illness. And I remind people, the disability may be a perpetual condition, but it is not a terminal one. So when we have to, so it's a constant education process with some of my colleagues. And every time I finally convince them that that's not a concern, they may no longer be in office and I have to start all over again. So in answer to the question, why haven't we gotten there yet? We've had a tremendous amount of change in the past 5 years in the Senate. And so it's, it's a simple numbers game. It's math. You need 32 votes to pass a piece of legislation in the Senate. But I think on a policy issue like this, you really want to have more broad-based support for it. What you don't want is to have a major piece of legislation like this pass on a bare, simple majority, because you don't want it to be subject to litigation, which is always a possibility. I like to build support for something. And I think that there is bipartisan support for this issue, even though we have, a fairly large Senate majority now. You still want to bring people from all walks of life to it, because this isn't really it's not a Republican or a Democratic or an independent issue. This is really a human issue, and we should, try and just build as much support as we possibly can and answer people's questions.
Yeah. Reverend Shockley, I wanted to bring you in on the question of organized religion and their views on medical aid and dying. Could we get you back for a moment?
Yes, certainly. I heard Senator Savino mention that there are no organized religions that support it as a body, but not all denominations are organized hierarchically, as some are. For example, the United Church of Christ is a congregationally based denomination. And so there are many individual pastors from all faiths and from all denominations that support medical aid and dying. And I certainly am one of them. I have many, many colleagues as well who support medical aid and dying. And ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, as a pastor, I need to be able to minister to my members who as individuals also have both the moral and spiritual autonomy to live their lives according to their understanding of God and their understanding of their faith. Even as their pastor, I don't dictate that for them. I am there to minister to them as they discern, decide, and then act in ways that are consistent with their faith and their moral and spiritual principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful, Reverend Shockley. Thank you so much. Michael, I don't know if you, Dr. Cooper White, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I want to echo what my colleague Madison has said, and also to say that often I think church bodies as a whole may be behind where the will of the people and the clergy are. For example, the document that I cited from the Episcopal Church that resolution was passed in 1991. And to the best of my research, I couldn't find anything that was done since. So one of the things that I think it's important for those of us who care about issues like this is to bring resolutions to update that kind of decision-making, because it's not at all clear that the majority of people in the denomination still agree with an older resolution.
Be helpful though, I think, because you're right. There are organized religions. There are some that have a much more in-depth presence in the halls of government, because they also have nonprofit arms that do a lot of charity work, or they run nonprofit organizations and hospitals. And so they have actually a deeper imprint or footprint in the legislative process. And that's probably why they have more of a deeper conversation with legislators as bills come through. And since most of you are more independent, it might be helpful though if we heard more from, or some members heard more from more of you about these types of conversations, and it might make them feel more comfortable as they make these decisions. Someone asked in the chat about what happened to the separation of church and state. I mean, there's no doubt that there is a separation of church and state, but we write laws every day that reflect the principles that exist in most religious practices. I mean, it's a crime in every state to commit murder, right? And that's, every religion recognizes the sanctity of life. And we all say, you know, whether you're, you know, from the Judeo-Christian faith or the Muslim faith or Hindu faith, you know, the taking of a human life is wrong. I don't know a single government that doesn't have, you know, a law that says murder is wrong. So we managed to interweave them, you know, without recognizing a particular religion as the right one. So so the point I'm trying to make is, even though we are legislators, our faith sometimes informs the way we look at life and the way we try and craft legislation. And we're supposed to, though, set aside our own personal religions so that we make laws for everybody. But it's hard to set aside what you've been taught to believe. And this is I will tell you, this is one of the most difficult things. I think this is harder for most people than issues of choice, the issue of marriage equality, because this goes to, you know, end of life, and nobody likes to talk about death. I've said this a million times. Even under the best of circumstances, we don't like to contemplate it.
I just wanted to chime in here and really to reinforce that point in our own experiences, even in terms of our internal conversations at SAGE. And I think about when Frank Stark and others brought this question of medical aid in dying to our board of directors a number of years ago for a conversation about what policy position the organization would take, just how emotional that conversation was. That there was so much kind of emotion that different people were bringing to the table. You know, ultimately, as an organization, our board, as our leaders, you know, energetically embraced this support for medical aid in dying. But what came before that was, you know, a really, really very personal conversation for many folks, people bringing forward their religious beliefs, some of their own life experiences, et cetera. And this is within the context of an advocacy organization that comes from a community that, as I was talking earlier, is really rooted in principles of autonomy and self-direction that I think make us equipped to embrace this issue very energetically. But even there, you know, it was an extensive conversation, and so it's I think that's just a microcosm of what you're describing, Senator Savino, and certainly Kermit, I'm sure you work within this work, and that it is it's a journey, right? It's a real journey, obviously, in the case of the New York State Assembly and Senate, a journey over a good number of years to help people work their way through those emotions, work through those religious perspectives, and hopefully ultimately come to a space of being able to embrace people's need and right in the circumstances of late stage terminal illness to make this choice for themselves.
You know,
I'd like to quote Barbara Coombs Lee, our founder and President Emeritus, in her book, Finish Strong. She says, she has a chapter that says, talking about death won't kill you. And part of our mission is to encourage the conversation. We are all going to die. And there's a lot of misery. And that misery is not just medical. It's personal, it's family, it's financial, a lot of misery that results from our avoidance of this conversation about death, which comes to us all. And so our mission is much broader than medical aid in dying. It is to help our culture, our society mature to the point where we can have meaningful, informed, and reasoned and reasonable conversations about death. We live in a moment that is unusual in human history. All of our grandparents probably died at home. Now, most people die in the hospital. It's just been 2 generations where the medicalization of death has taken over and separated us from this very, very human experience. And so our mission at Compassion and Choices is to re-engage the conversation so that we can, as Barbara likes to say, put our priorities first at life's end. This is not a conversation we should avoid. We need to encourage people to fill out advance directives, even though they're not as effective as we want them to be. Have those conversations with your family so that they know what you want at life's end. Have that conversation with your doctor to make sure you have the right doctor who will support your decisions at the end of life.
You know, as someone who has sat in church basements, at county fairs, at the state fair in Syracuse, at little events all across the state, I completely understand, Senator Savino, when you say people don't want to talk about death and dying. You know, they see our booth. Some of them make a beeline. They're nurses often. You know, they make a beeline. They want to talk. They want to sign our petition. Others are more wary. But I'll tell you what. Once you engage people in a conversation, I'm so glad I have a social work degree, honestly, because people they don't have the opportunity to talk about death and dying. And once they do, you open up those floodgates. I mean, 9 out of 10 people walk away a supporter, even if they would never use it themselves. And COVID has brought, you know, death and dying to the TV screen. We see the names, we see the numbers, we experience it in our own lives. Death and dying is not far from anyone's mind right now, just like it was for us, right, Michael? And during the AIDS epidemic, you couldn't get away from death and dying if you were that age and you loved people in that community.
Corinne, what's so important about what you're saying is, you're right. Once people start the conversation, what we're offering them, the information that we're offering them, they welcome it very much. The problem is when they have this conversation, it's often too late to do anything about it.
That's right.
They are far advanced in their illness. We are trying to amend the law in California now to waive the 15-day waiting period. Some terminally ill persons who recognize that this is an option and reach out for it don't survive the 15 days. Other people can't complete the 30 different steps that have to be accomplished before you can receive your prescription. And so our mission, again, is to encourage people to have this conversation in advance so that you can do something about it, so you can make a decision and about your death and not have your death make all of your decisions for you.
That's so true, Reverend Shockley. And, you know, another thing that I've heard, I think it was Diane Rehm, but others have said it in the past, is that any lawmaker who is worried about this or not wanting to talk about it is one bad death away from seriously considering it. And it makes me think about, we have 2 terminally ill supporters on Long Island who our staff is with right now, talking to them about advocating for this option, filming them, you know, possibly in their last days. And one of them said, you know, it isn't a priority for anyone, right? I mean, we see the legislature pass bills. I mean, I'm an environmentalist. I love banning the use of single-use hotel toiletries, right? That was a priority for the legislature the other day. Medical aid in dying isn't a priority for anyone until it is. Until you have a loved one who's gotten a diagnosis, you've had a constituent sit in front of you and beg for this. And so I'm pivoting here because I want to address another question about New Jersey. Folks have asked in the chat box, how did we pass this law in New Jersey? And I'll tell you how. We had scrappy and courageous bill sponsors like we have here in New York. Scrappy and courageous bill sponsors who weren't going to take no for an answer because they knew that this was the right thing to do. And so look, we're talking about religion throughout this whole event. The bill sponsor, the majority leader in the Senate, the speaker in the House and the Assembly in New Jersey, they were all Catholic. The governor was Catholic. So many of the lawmakers that voted for that bill were Catholic. And what they knew was that even though they might not have wanted this for themselves, they knew they represented a wide variety of constituents. And so, yes, there was pressure from the Catholic Church. Yes, there was pressure from people living with disabilities. But what those bill sponsors and leaders in the legislature in New Jersey did was they looked at the evidence and they said, look, these fears that you have of people living with disabilities, their relatives doing something nefarious, that happens now. You can decide not to take your relative for care. You can over-medicate, you can under-medicate. It's not the regime of, it's not having a medical aid in dying law in place that has those things happen. Those things happen now. Medical aid in dying puts the choices about end-of-life care in the patient's hands alone. And that's what those leaders in New Jersey recognized, and they moved that bill. But it didn't happen without people contacting their lawmakers over and over and over and again, particularly when it looked like nothing was going to happen, when it looked like we were stuck in that state. Our advocates, people who strongly believe in this option, kept calling, kept writing emails, kept sharing their stories. And that's what got that bill passed in New Jersey. And I believe that that's how we're going to get that bill passed in New York. Courageous bill sponsors who are going to be able to speak truth to the myths that people put forward.
Corinne, I just wanted to make a quick comment when you were referencing how this issue isn't a priority for people until it is, right? Until they find themselves in these really excruciating moments. And I think one of the things that's so powerful that Compassion and Choices has been doing is lifting up through videos, for example, in really vivid way, the stories of people for whom they are in that moment, right? Like you were talking about earlier. I think about the video about Jay Callio, for example, and how powerful that is for anybody who watches that video. Whether you know the person or not, you can imagine yourself or a loved one in that situation. And I think that really, helps too. That kind of education really helps to lift up the immediacy of this issue and how this could be an issue that's really critically important for any of us in our lives. I know at SAGE, we're going to be, promoting, I think it's in the month of, it's coming out, promoting that video of Jay as a way of trying to mobilize our own community, our own participants and supporters and membership to step up and make those calls and write those letters. And so I really appreciate that work that Compassion and Choices is doing around lifting up those personal stories through videos and other means, and would encourage all of us to keep doing that because it does make it much more personal and much more directly and immediately relevant.
I think we have time for one more question. And the question that we got here is, how does the legislation address people with mental illness caused by their terminal illness diagnosis, depression and other mental illness? Senator, I'm not sure if you or Reverend Shockley want to address that. I can certainly answer it, but I'm going to punt it over to you first.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, Reverend Shockley, go ahead, and then I'll follow up.
My brief comment would be, to my understanding, once a person has qualified, there's not a process that disqualifies them. That's one statement. Secondly, depression has a variety of categories and grades, as opposed to feeling sad about one's illness or imminent death is a light form, as opposed to a clinical and chemical depression, which prevents a person from making rational decisions. So the word depression has a broad definition, but in all of these decisions, what we have as our primary threshold is that the person is terminal and that they are making a decision for themselves. Mind you, most people, over 2/3 of the people who receive the prescription, do not ingest or take the prescription. Most people find a primary benefit in the recognition that should their pain become unbearable, they have an option. Many of those people endure as much pain and endure incredible pain but are benefited by the knowledge that they have a choice to avoid that pain if they so choose. In fact, people who never receive the prescription, living in a state that has the law, gives everyone in that state a benefit. And so I understand your concern, but those are the things that I understand at this point. Senator, you have other to add?
Thank you. Thank you for that very well reasoned answer. But the statute does address the concern that was raised, and remember, the person, a person, in order to qualify for medical aid in dying, as it's written here and in every other state, would have to first have a diagnosis and a prognosis that has to be confirmed by 2 doctors. Both doctors would have to make sure that the person is making the request of their own volition. The attending physician would have to inform the patient of their options, including both palliative care and hospice care and all their end-of-life options. If either of the 2 doctors, if they had any concerns about the patient's mental capacity, because remember, they have to have the mental capacity to make the request and make the decision, they could refer them for a mental health professional for an assessment. And if that mental health professional didn't believe that the patient had the capacity, they wouldn't be able to avail themselves. Now, that's what the statute says. But as we know, people who are suffering from the recognition that their life is about to end, they go through the 5 stages of grief. Depression may be part of that, but that is not what we would. I'm not a psychiatrist. I might have an undergrad degree in psychology. I know a lot about social work, as you do, Corinne. That may not necessarily rise to the level of clinical depression, but a person at facing these moments may be depressed. That does not necessarily mean they would not qualify for medical aid in dying. If the person was suffering from a mental health breakdown, that might interrupt the possibility of medical aid in dying. But we allow for that potential in the law, that a person has to have mental capacity to be able to make this decision. But let's go back again to what medical aid in dying has really meant to a lot of people who are suffering tremendously at the end of life, not just physically, but emotionally, recognizing that they are facing the end of their life. It's provided them with the insurance that if it gets to the point where I don't believe I have any control, I have this option, that I don't have to suffer unnecessarily. And that in and of itself has provided a tremendous amount of peace of mind for people to allow them to work through that process. And as we've seen in many states, many patients, even when they have it, never use it. And that is worth, just as much as any other end of life option.
Yeah. Thank you.
And
thank Reverend. Yeah.
I want to point to a corollary question in the chat, which had to do with dementia and Alzheimer's as well. My mother died of Alzheimer's, and we were not able to I had to do her pulse because it had become too advanced. We were not able to talk with her about her wishes by the time she already had dementia. I wish we had been able to do that before, and I still urge everybody I know to take care of your end of life wishes while you're well. But just as a follow-up, if someone has dementia, does that disqualify them then from earlier wishes that they've expressed?
It doesn't disqualify them from earlier wishes that they've expressed. And in the chat box, we've posted some resources for how people can plan for the care that they want in the event of a dementia or Alzheimer's diagnosis. But you couldn't access medical aid in dying. What's really interesting about these laws is that they really are about patient autonomy, and they're directed by the patient from start to finish, from the initial request to self-ingesting the medication. It's all about the patient making contemporaneous decisions at the time. So you can't put in an advance directive that if you live in a state that authorizes medical aid in dying, that you want that. First of all, you can't do that. The request has to be made when you have 6 months or less to live, but then you also need to be able to self-ingest the medication. I think as Senator Savino noted, medical aid in dying only solves one of our problems that we need to grapple with at the end of life. And it seems like a good place to stop, because Compassion and Choices, and so many of us, right, are really dedicated to improving end of life care along the whole spectrum. And so medical aid in dying is one piece of that. And I'm so grateful to this panel and to Union Theological Seminary and to SAGE for engaging in this really rich discussion today. I know that some folks are asking about the poll question, and here's the poll results. Someone said we're preaching to the choir, and I'll tell you what, it's very difficult to get this information out there. So if you're on this webinar and you think we're preaching to the choir and you have access to other venues where we can have this conversation, let's bring this conversation to those venues. I really ask you to volunteer. There's many links in the chat box to sign up to help. And if you want to do that and broaden this conversation, I encourage you to do that. I'm going to stop here and pass it over to Dr. Cooper White to close us out this afternoon.
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you to all the colleagues on this panel. This has been a wonderful, rich banquet of information, and also debunking some myths and misinformation that are just so important. So thank you to all of you who came today, and I hope that you'll be able to follow up in your own communities as you think through all of these options and the legislative work that also can be done. I want to just share my screen for a moment to invite you to forthcoming events at Union Theological Seminary. And if you go to our main webpage, utsnyc.edu, and scroll down, and you will see Union happenings and news, and there you will find future events and recent events that are also available recorded. So thank you for being with us today. We're all very grateful for everyone on this call, and wish you well as you go forward. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe.